All right, you're good.
A joyful day, a blessed day.
Thank you.
So our lesson is continuing on lessons from 1 Corinthians. This morning's lesson, for those that studied, is entitled Questions About Marriage. The key verse was in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 17. As God has distributed to every man, as the Lord has called every one, so let him walk. The focus of our lesson is to explore some of Paul's teaching regarding marriage and live according to our gifting. Sexuality and marriage are commonly portrayed in television and movies, and this unfortunately has shaped, in many cases, negatively the way society does think about sex and marriage. And in many ways, the moral standards of society today are similar to those that existed during the time in which Paul wrote. Godly standards concerning marriage and sex are trivialized without a great deal of concern for morality. And God's word is clear concerning Christians regarding marriage and morality. So to start out in chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, it says, Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, every woman her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, likewise the wife to the husband. The wife has not power of her own body, but the husband. Likewise, the husband has not the power of his body, but the wife. So, beginning here in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, Paul answered a series of questions that had arisen among the Christians at the church in Corinth. The first question that he addressed actually dealt with whether or not someone should marry. And it may seem strange that that question would even arise. So to understand the issue, we need to look a little further here at what Paul was addressing in Corinth. And among other issues, there were Gnostic beliefs that were trying to influence the church. Now, what Gnosticism is, Gnosticism teaches that the spiritual is good and everything physical or material is evil. And this created two issues. First, because the spirit and the flesh were regarded as unrelated, one could indulge in anything in their flesh like they wanted to because it wouldn't affect their spirit. And Paul addressed that back in chapter 5 when he was teaching about immorality. So the second error in this Gnostic belief system was, since the physical body and anything physical was evil, any physical desires should be denied, and this resulted in teaching that even good things, if they have to do the physical, should be avoided. So, such as sexual intimacy within marriage, the Gnostics considered that as evil because it had to do with the physical. And so, Paul felt it necessary to strongly emphasize sexual morality was writing about marriage. And when you study it out and look at it, the Corinthian church was affected by the culture around it. And for those that might have studied history, you already know, but Corinth was a city that was known for its sexual immorality in the ancient world. There was a huge temple dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite, which history tells us literally housed hundreds of religious prostitutes. And immorality was a matter of pagan worship, and it was rampant. And many of the Corinthian Christians did clearly recognize they had to turn from such immorality, but in doing so, because of the Gnosticism that was prevalent, were wondering if they had to reject sexual relationships altogether. And so the Apostle Paul addressed that matter here in verses 1 through 7. And Paul argued that it was acceptable to remain single and as a result abstain from sexual intimacy, but he wanted the Corinthians to know that the opposite was also acceptable as well, to be married. And Paul warned, verses 1 and 2 that we already read, that sexual relationships outside of marriage were sinful and for some a difficult temptation to avoid, so therefore the proper place for sexual intimacy being in marriage. And especially in our society, it seems to be a consistent theme that sexuality is constantly depicted in a way that emphasizes self-gratification above all else. But when you study it out biblically, sex is not necessarily seen as a means of self-fulfillment, but an act that focuses on bringing fulfillment to one's spouse. And sexual relationships in marriage, we know, should reflect that commitment to stay with that person, because what did verse 3 and 4 tell us? That you're no longer two, but you're one. So continuing on here, reading a few more verses, 5, 6, and 7, the Apostle Paul said, "Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your," I can't even talk today, "not for your incontinency, but speak this by permission. I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. I would that all men were even as myself, but every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that." So, we know that Satan targets marriages, and he actually began sowing seeds of what? Seeds of distrust and seeds of selfishness way back in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And the resulting sin ultimately brought shame to the first couple, undermining that intimacy that God intends for marriage. And so we know that Satan continues to attempt to steal intimacy from married couples today, attempting to undermine marriages, whether that be through temptation, whether that be through discord. And the Apostle Paul here makes it clear that as any couple, but Christian couples especially, should never use sex as a weapon, depriving people as a form of manipulation. In another way, one should not somehow seek out a greater holiness or a greater commitment to God by depriving their spouse. And so Paul made this point very clear in 1 Corinthians 5:5. I'll go ahead and read that real quick, where he said, "Deliver such as one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus." So it's very important also 7:5, "Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourself over to fasting and prayer, and then come together again." So it's very important sex not be used as a weapon, deprivation, or manipulation. And if deprivation occurs, rather than that relationship becoming closer, usually that couple is going to drift apart. And Paul declared that married couples should not deprive one another of intimacy unless it's for a short time. Because intimacy in marriage helps avoid situations in which Satan might bring temptation to one or both spouses. And so it's very important. Intimacy is key. And, some people choose to live single, celibate lives, and others have a strong need that they almost have to be married. And I've seen both extremes. And so Paul explained that some people have almost what we would call a gift of celibacy, almost like he called it almost like a special gift from God in a way. And he indicated that those with the gift of celibacy have the ability to refrain from fornication. And when a person has this special gifting, they should use it to maximize their ministry potential. And Paul noted, we read in verse 6, that he was not making it a command with regard to either marriage or singleness. Instead, he's instructing the people on godly marriages, as well as what could be considered a benefit of celibacy. The world's view of sexuality, I don't know, when I think of the world, I think of casual and I think of self-centered. Those are kind of my personal interpretation on the world's view on sexuality. But we have here what a Christian's viewpoint should be. It should be selfless. It should be exclusive. It should be beneficial. It should be godly. Any thoughts or comments from anyone?
Yeah, I think that like another word I guess you can use for the worldview is almost careless in their act, which since there's so much danger and all the other consequences.
It truly is, and difficult for me to even comprehend sometimes people's viewpoint on the whole sexuality thing. And granted, I've been in church most of my life, but it still is hard for me to even comprehend that mindset. We have so many people we know that it really is no big deal. Like, I can lose track of the number of people we know that, because we're committed to each other, it's okay. Marriage is just a piece of paper. I know so many people, it's not like it used to be where, oops, I had sex outside of marriage and I got pregnant and now we're dealing with it. It's intentionally having families, even though there's no marriage. Strangest thing in the world for me to comprehend, to be honest. I can't even get that mindset. Like, how do you call yourself married when you're not really married? How do you say that you're a family. No, you're not a family.
Yeah.
Legally, you are not a family.
And I guess I'm like you, because I grew up pretty much in church all of my life too, and I remember after I got divorced that there was it shocked me because there was an older lady who told me, "Oh, honey, you don't have to have a husband to have children," and I was just utterly shocked. I mean, it's like I couldn't comprehend. I did not believe
Yeah.
that, that you're telling me this, and that you're somebody I should be looking up to, able to get wise counsel. And it's like, okay, that's not wise.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's just I couldn't comprehend that. I mean, I'm just okay.
And I guess it's part of my my pragmatic thinking as well, and kind of common sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, one, it's morally wrong. We know that. Secondly, why wouldn't you want that legal protection of an actual marriage for your child? That legal protection in case something were to happen. I mean, we never think anything's going to happen, but in case it does, I couldn't imagine not, having that legalness of it. But so that casualness, almost reckless, like you said, kind of scary sometimes. So continuing on here, what the Apostle Paul wrote, we'll go and read verses 8 through 11. I say therefore to the unmarried and the widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, I'm so sorry, let them marry. It is better to marry than to burn, and unto, meaning burn with lust. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. If she depart, let her remain unmarried, be reconciled. Let not the husband put away his wife. So, establishing both the value, Paul here is addressing a specific situation. He addressed those with the gift of singleness. He addressed those without the gift of singleness. And Paul recognized that it is unrealistic to believe that everyone will have the same focus when it comes to this. And he said it's better to marry than to burn. In other words, better to marry than to succumb to the temptation of sexual relationships outside of marriage. And we know that in God's ultimate choice, of course, is that marriage is one husband, one wife. Sometimes things happen morally, the other spouse maybe not be what they should in Christ, and so for self-preservation, divorce is the only option. And so, there's many reasons for divorce. Infidelity is a big one that is, to me, infidelity is kind of a no-brainer reason to divorce, but, that's just me. I know people that have made it through infidelity and they've, with God's help, been restored and their marriage is still intact. But I also know people where one party had sexual issues that the other party just could never overcome, so they had to get out of that marriage because they couldn't submit themselves to health issues or whatever else, might come up. So in those cases, obviously God doesn't expect us to put ourselves in danger, because someone has a sexual addiction they can't control. I know people that have had to divorced because they just never could get it together. And there's people that I've seen divorced and I'm like, that should never have happened. It just, they had some financial struggles, maybe, one party was selfish and never could get past that. And if both parties had simply turned to God and made Jesus Christ the focus of their marriage would have been saved. and their family would have been saved, and their children wouldn't be going through everything they're going through now. But, you know, God's ultimate purpose is, of course, that we have that commitment, that we honor and unconditional love. Any thoughts or comments on that from anybody?
I think it's neat because in verse 8, I never, sometimes you look at passages and they kind of jump out at you or stuff you never noticed before. Because he speaks to, like you said, he spoke to the never married, you know, the single, the ones who are married, and then he spoke to the unmarried and the widows. So you have those that have experienced marriage before, but they're now single again. So he addressed, nobody escaped having to deal with their sexual morality, basically.
Very true. So continuing on in verses 12 through 16, but to the rest speak I not the Lord. If any brother has a wife that believes not, she is pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which has a husband that believes not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or knowest thou, O man, whether you shall save your wife? So what we have here is that there were Christians in the Corinthian church whose spouses did not follow them into making that commitment to Jesus Christ. And that's very common even in our society today. Obviously, if you're a Christian, you should only marry a Christian. But let's say you marry somebody before either of you get saved, and then one decides to commit their life to Christ. In some marriages, that can cause a lot of issues. But what the Apostle Paul is telling us here is, you know, if you've made a commitment to Jesus but the spouse didn't, these new Christians here are wondering what they should do. And he left the decision up to the person not following the Lord, interestingly enough. And if that individual wanted to stay in the marriage, then the new Christian was to honor the commitment, the decision they had made, and stay with that person, even though their spouse didn't decide to accept Jesus. And Paul pointed out that the situation actually has a sanctifying effect, if you will, on the relationship. If one spouse is a Christian and the other isn't, the spouse that's a Christian is bringing the blessings of God on that whole house and that whole family. Paul's writings also reflect that he understood kind of the realities of life, however, because he's also saying not all non-Christians are going to stay married to someone that's a Christian. And Paul stated that if the unsaved husband or wife rejects their spouse and exits the relationship, allow them to do so in the interest of peace. And we obviously do our best to share the love of Christ with an unbelieving spouse, but if that person ultimately decided to leave, then the Apostle Paul says, I'm paraphrasing, let them leave, you're not to blame, basically is what he's saying there. And continuing on in chapter 7, a few more verses, 25 through 31. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that have obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, this is good for the present distress. It is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, it shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. But this, I say, brethren, the time is short. It remains both that they have wives as though they had none. And so Paul here is narrowing his discussion of the wisdom of getting married given the situation that Corinthians were facing. In other words, he identified a present distress or a crisis. And he's likely, we don't know for sure, but he most likely was referring to the increased persecution that Christians were facing because of their faith in Corinth and the ancient world. And so, obviously, it would be easier to deal with that kind of crisis and endure it if you didn't have a spouse to consider in the natural. You only have to worry about yourself. You don't have to worry about, the spouse or somebody being able to use them as a weapon against you or anything like that. And so Paul said, based on this present distress or this crisis we're going through, it would be an advantage to remain unmarried. And throughout history, we do see people that chose to become unmarried. The example it listed in our book was the missionary Lillian Thrasher. She rejected a marriage proposal, chose to follow God's direction, and instead spent her entire life ministering to orphan children in Egypt. And marriage is very typical, but there are circumstances that lead people to choose to commit to a single life and instead focus on the ministry. And the Apostle Paul didn't tell the Corinthians who were married to separate, but he did counsel a little bit to make sure if they were seeking marriage, that it was truly a wise, lifelong decision that they were making, and for them to realize that.
I think that's kind of neat because of the way he said that I can almost picture some of them using it as an escape clause. Oh, I can get out of my marriage, but he instructed them that if you marry, don't use this as a reason to get rid of your spouse.
Exactly. This is not
this is not a get out of jail
not
card.
Not a get out of jail free card, not an escape clause. Very good, Sister Livett. I like that. So, the last few verses 32 through 40, I'm not going to read for the sake of time, but the Apostle Paul is basically contrasting the responsibilities of the married and the unmarried and giving advice to Christian widows and how it's important to stay focused on godly priorities even amid challenges of life. And so the Apostle Paul helped put those kind of questions into perspective, drawing a contrast between the Lord's work and focusing on the affairs of the world. And obviously, if, singleness for Paul, it was easier for Paul to endure prison because he was a single man and he didn't have a family or a wife that he was having to worry about while he was being unjustly imprisoned. And Paul was saying that marriage responsibilities can absolutely complicate one's ministry options. And ultimately, it does not matter if a Christian is married or not. we have to live faithfully for God no matter how difficult it may seem at times. And Paul ended his comments about marriage by explaining that although he saw great wisdom in staying single, he understood marriage to be a viable option. And Paul left the decision up to the individual Christians as they evaluated their own situations and their own relationships. And then Paul addressed the issue of widows, declaring marriage is for a lifetime but not for eternity. When the person dies, the marriage ceases to exist. So a widow should never feel guilty if they wish to marry again, to have that human companionship. And so that's what the Apostle Paul was telling us there in the very end, 39 and 40. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will. So in closing here, Christian marriages should be marked by unconditional love, a lifetime commitment, and a strong focus on the purposes of God. Marriage, however, should not be our ultimate goal. There are times and situations when singleness would be better. And so a Christian's marital situation has to be secondary to their ultimate relationship with Jesus Christ. I mean, if someone is so focused on being married that that's all they think about, their relationship with the Lord and their ministry will suffer. So it's putting the Lord and Him first, and then what comes about. So, in closing, a couple of things that were in our lesson, to consider these questions. As a married person, are we showing unconditional love to our spouse in practical ways? Or as a single person, are we maximizing all of our ministry potential while we have the freedom to do so? And that's our lesson for today. Thank you. Any closing comments?
That's a good lesson.